Hello, my name is Fred Trotter. I am a healthcare data journalist, and I'm going to talk about a bunch of the details about how regulation data works. And this might be a pretty boring session. So if you're not super into regulations, this video might not be for you. Before I always get started, I like to say one thing I'm thankful for. And I just found out that there is a restaurant in DC that specifically has Texas barbecue in the name. And there's a bunch of other ones that have Texas barbecue menu items. Um, so I guess what I'm thankful for is food from home. Um, so I'm really grateful for that. So to get started, a lot of what I work on is related to how decisions that the federal government makes and impacts the healthcare system. I'm super interested in privacy stuff. I'm interested in anything that has to do with data about how the whole healthcare system is working, about detecting bad actors in the healthcare system, and um, and that means that I am constantly a customer of regulations.gov. And regulations.gov, I think, is the best of several views on regulation data that's available from the federal government. I want to start with the kind of thing, with an explanation of the kind of thing that I'm interested in. So I'm going to switch the web browser here up. This is an analysis that Alma Trotter, my sister, and another journalist who works with CareSet, and we were used to be called DocGraph. This was in the DocGraph era of our organization. This is an analysis that she did comparing meaningful use stage 1 and 2. And what it did was very carefully document the things that an electronic healthcare record would do. Not just, I guess, to step back, meaningful use was a set of standards that was mandated under the first part of Obamacare. People think of Obamacare mostly as the Affordable Care Act. It was actually two acts. The first one was the um, uh, the Stimulus Act that Obama passed when he first went into office, that included funding for electronic healthcare record systems. And that was the first kind of pillar of what we now call Obamacare. Was that work, and it made forced hospitals and clinicians in the United States to computerize. Many of whom had kind of started using computers, but they weren't really using electronic healthcare records. They were usually using practice management systems or hospital management systems, which means they used data to help themselves get paid, but not necessarily to inform patient care in a way that was really helpful. And so what they when they gave out this funding, they told Health and Human Services that they needed to create a set of standards for the meaningful use of electronic healthcare records. They weren't going to just give this money to doctors. The doctors would have to, the doctors in the hospitals and the clinicians in general would have to demonstrate that they were using electronic healthcare record technology effectively. And so this was a multi-year regulatory process, and there were stages, stage 1 and stage 2, of the regulations that were released and the standards that were released. And we did a comparison. So, for instance, there's a bunch of core measures in version 1 that stayed. It's kind of clinical summaries and smoking status, vital signs, demographics, simple stuff. And then they really did change the things that used to be menu measures became standards, and then they also had and different levels. So, for instance, lab results, you had to do more lab results. You had decreases on some percentages on things, which was interesting. And then you had companions and expansions, where they consolidated some things into one standard, and then they expanded some things into multiple standards. And we spent a huge amount of time with Alma spending the bulk of it, figuring out, of course, this is things that were not included in our analysis, but just figuring out what was the difference. And of course, since that time, there have been probably, I don't know, 4 eras of regulation that have come out about electronic health records in one way or another. And of course, now they have different standards, and there's a whole paradigm of that has shifted about how they handle interoperability. And there's a lot of things that have changed about the regulatory topic of how we pay clinicians in the United States to use digital systems. So this is the kind of topic that I care about. Let's take a look at regulations.gov, and let's look for, I'm going to type this again for us, see how kind of this is the starting page here. And it has other, regulations that are coming through. And just in general, like notice these little icons. And the icons have meanings. And if I search for meaningful use, we'll see that we have kind of other topics, notices, supporting and related material, rules, proposed rules. And if we look up here at the top, sure enough, we have the first in 2009, the first notice for public comment of the initial meaningful use definition. And then we have a policy committee that's been meeting about the topic of meaningful use. And in fact, there's a bunch of these. And then there's more work group. And now we're talking about the definition of the common and meaningful use debts 2014. After the while, they stopped. They started naming them by years rather than versions. And then, of course, they changed the name to the Electronic Health Record Incentive Program. And these are all proposed rules. So, one thing is what's the difference between a rule? What's the difference between a proposed rule, supporting related material, notices, other? There's all kinds of information here that you're seeing in these results. But notice at the very top that we're searching automatically for documents. The other thing we could search for is comments. And the other thing we could search for is dockets. And we're going to talk about how those are organized. Now, I should say that the reason I'm recording this is for a class that Ben Coleman teaches at Moravian that has been working for years as their senior project to further the efforts of making this data transparent. And they're going to be making some big announcements soon about the data availability, and it's going to be really exciting. And you can already get it on S3. And if you want to get it, you have to pay for it now. You have to request or pays data. So if you cost like $80, but if you contact me, I can send you a link to the S3. And feel free to email me for that, and I'll send it to you. Although soon there'll be a GitHub page, and it'll be pretty easy to get to very, very soon. But one of the things that the students need, they're now thinking about how to put on top of that data, make search improvements. And one thing that I want to communicate to them is how inconvenient it is that I can't search dockets, documents, and comments at the same time for meaningful use and get some kind of cohesive result back that would make some sense. Before we go on to talk about just how this data is organized, I just want to review some of the other major websites that are available here. This is, actually, let's go back. That one goes over here towards the end. This is the Federal Register. Now, there are a bunch of things that are published in the Federal Register, notably executive orders beyond just regulations, but everything that is in regulations.gov from a document perspective, from the things that are published, are also in the Federal Register. And the Federal Register also typically allows for comments to be collected. So this is a docket, a document. I don't think this is a request for information that I will be commenting on about how the Medicare data program works and how Part C data should be handled. But this is something that I really care about. Notice you have the submit a formal comment button up here, but you also have down here a link back over to regulations.gov. So pretty much everything on regulations.gov, except for the comments. And I think you can see comments, up here. So both the Federal Register and regulations.gov have access to some of the same data. And they both have some API capabilities, I believe, but they do work in different ways. So I will go back and forth, and I will search for sometimes on Federal Register and sometimes on regulations.gov, depending on kind of what arbitrary point in time I'm thinking of. And there are some different features in the search. I think advanced document search here really shows some of the things that you can do easily inside the Federal Register that are not necessarily part of the advanced search over on regulations.gov, which I think is worth paying attention to. But it should be noted that both systems have access to the same data. But there's more. There's this website called reginfo.com that's run by the OMB. Now, I'll get into this in a little bit, but the OMB is the organization that has to approve of essentially every regulation that goes out, and they're doing a multifaceted analysis that includes stuff like, is it going to impact small businesses? Is it going to have an energy impact? Is it going to have just a big financial impact? And they have approval, and they've got, they'll also have clarifications, like they'll have questions for the regulatory agencies. So when a regulatory agency sends their stuff to review with the OMB, they'll do that. But this website has all of the reviews. So you can actually look at, I think there's 3 different big buckets of types of reviews that they're doing. But I think you can go here and you can search for the regulatory RIN and get information about not necessarily the regulation as it stands for public comments and from the agency's perspective, but from the perspective of the review of OMB. And then there's this really top level website that the government offers called GovInfo, which is kind of like the biggest bucket, because it has really all of these different things, including the Federal Register. And in many of these cases, the GovInfo has raw data. They like to publish things in XML a bunch about law, about the presidential documents. There's just a ton of stuff in here that's not anywhere else. And this is, from what I can tell, one of the top level organizational websites. And it has, in many cases, raw data versions of a bunch of other stuff. There's actually a couple of other websites, including ECFR, if I remember correctly, but I'm going to talk about in a second. But before I get into that, I just want to talk about, I'm just showing you these big websites that have these big organizational systems. And then I also want to show you this, which is actually from reginfo.gov, which is the process for regulatory rulemaking. Let me see if I can, zoom in here. Step 1, and what I have done is I've tried to diagram this process with more accuracy, again, from my perspective, and mostly so that I can see, I can show what I'm trying to search for. But if I go to when anything comes up on regulations.gov, it is because an agency believes that there is a reason to release or update regulations, and there's only a few reasons why they do that. Most of those reasons are listed here, but the big ones are they will do it whenever Congress tells them to. They will do it when the president just tells them to, the courts tell them to, and whenever they have agency initiatives, whenever they have an existing regulatory responsibility and the industrial landscape changes, for instance, that would cause them to re-regulate. But they have a ton of initiating events for what it is that starts a particular regulation going. And then they decide whether or not they are going to, give notice in advance. And then they develop a proposed rule. And a proposed rule is basically them saying to the world, this is what we want to do, and this is our justification. Here are our thoughts, and here's what we've decided to do. And the next stage, and and they're asking for feedback. So they will ask very specific questions. So first of all, they'll say, here's our plan, comment on any part of the plan. But they will also say, we're not sure about this part of the plan. Give us specific information about this. And if you want to influence how the government functions, giving them specific information that is relevant when they are asking for more information about a particular industry is really, really important. It's really important for patients to be aware of, especially when a patient interest is being contradicted by an industry interest, for patients to be aware about regulations and when they should comment on them. And then they send it to the OMB for review. And this is when there is a huge amount of decision-making made by the OMB about budgetary impacts. I think the kinds of things they're thinking about is, how will this impact small businesses? Will there be a paperwork Reduction Act impact? So are they causing too much paperwork to unnecessarily be created? And then after it's reviewed, they publish it. That's the first time that we would see it. And then they spend this time analyzing public comments. Now, here's the controversial part of this. They say that every comment submitted is read. I think that is bending the truth a little bit. I think that's probably very true when you're talking about a regulatory topic that is highly specialized, and you've got 30 companies and industry experts that are commenting. And so you're talking about reading 30 comments. I'm sure they do absolutely read all 1,000 comments, but there's tons of cases where people submit the same comment 10,000 times. I don't think they're actually reading each one of those 10,000 comments. I think they actually struggle to handle knowing that the same comment has actually been submitted 10,000 times. And then I also think that in general, when you have, in some cases, tens of thousands of comments, it's just not reasonable to assume that they are actually meaningful reading this. But I do think that they do put in a good faith effort, and that they spend a lot of time trying to make sure that they do mine out all the concepts and to handle that as best they can. But in some senses, one of the things that I think I want to be able to improve things is that it's not just the people on the outside of the government that need data tools to work with this comment data. It's people on the inside of the government too. So it is my hope that this project called Relations out of Moravian is going to be at least part of, if not solving those problems, then suggesting strongly directions that can be taken to solve those problems. But the comments come in, they're read, and they're processed, and they're thought of. And, while in so many cases the volume prevents them from reading every single comment, the American Hospital Association, the American Medical Association, PhRMA, like the Pharma Representation Group, other big groups, pharmacy associations, big companies, pharmaceutical companies, when you're talking about anything to do with medication stuff, device companies, when you're talking about device stuff. I mean, whenever there is a major player who is going to be impacted by regulation, and then how their impact is going to be felt by the public, they're listened to, right? So the comments that come in from organizations like the ones I've just listed are given sway. In many cases, sway that is influenced by the political affiliations of the appointees in the government who are ultimately in charge of these agencies because they're appointed by the president, or they're appointed by the people who are appointed by the president to run them. So, but nonetheless, even when the leaders of the various agencies disagree with what the public is saying, they do consider them. And this is a really important part of our democratic process. This is a part where we try to get the details right. And I think it's just more important than people understand. Then they develop a final rule. Now, and then they send the final rule to OMB for review, and then they publish the final rule. And the key thing about this publishing of the final rule process, which again has to, they change things based on the comments. Then they resubmit it to OMB saying, okay, well, we changed our plans. Here's how we want to handle it. and then they finally publish a final review. In the final review, they will also include, they will respond to commenters, and they will say why they decided to regulate in a different way. And in many cases, and I mean literally cases, in many court cases, when someone sues the federal government or they sue an industrial player, or they go in and the way that someone has been regulated, or the way someone is acting in the marketplace as a result of their regulations comes up in front of a judge. The responses to comments are used to color the thinking and intention of the regulators, and will very, very frequently influence how industry actually approaches solving a particular problem. So I comment constantly on all these things, and I'm very used to having regulators disagree with me, and I'm often one commenter said, and then they'll say why, summarize what I said, and then they'll say why they disagree with me. Well, the why they disagree with me part could have, in some cases, a very substantial impact on the way the world reacts to the regulation as a whole. Because in some senses, the reasons why you didn't go left and you went right are better understood when you examine the discussions of why you didn't go left. So that's the basic thing. So this is a wonderful chart. I like the kind of ladder stair-step effects. There's a bunch of details here in other boxes that I think it's really worth Googling this, and so I think if you're thinking about getting into the understanding the regulatory process, this is definitely the place to start. Here is a kind of more reflective part. So first of all, there at GovInfo, there is regulatory stuff, there's Federal Register stuff, and there's also a bunch of other stuff. So one thing that I think is worth pointing out here, and I'm going to zoom in because that's kind of the point of this mirror board, is that there is, on GovInfo, there is bulk data on the Code of Federal Regulations. And that is where a regulation will end up when it is fully approved. The other place that it will end up when it is fully approved is over here at ecfr.gov, which is a place to browse and search current federal regulations, right? So if you're thinking of this process as kind of baking a pie, like when you look at regulations.gov and Federal Register, you're looking at the back of the bakery, and this is kind of all the pastries laid out front, right? It's the front end. It's the things that the public has to interact with and is obligated to follow because they're regulations, industrial regulations in the United States. But this browse, but I think both eCFR and then this bulk download, I think, is an XML. So I think those are relevant. So now let's zoom in a little bit to just what is on the Federal Register. Now, the Federal Register has two basic components. Everything that's in regulations.gov, which is all the regulations. And then also it has this kind of non-regulatory section, which is mostly presidential actions, executive orders, memorandums, determination notices, and proclamations, which are a whole subject themselves. Like each one of these things has an important history, and and it's just, they have these as data, and this is important stuff too. But and I think one of the reasons why that is true is if we look over here at the initializing events, an executive order is absolutely one of the ways that regulation starts. So you have any of these initializing events, an act of Congress, a congressional investigation, landscape change, whatever, then you have this decision, are we going to regulate this? And they can kind of go in several different ways. One is they can just publish more information. They can publish a notice. And in some senses, this is just the most generic, we're informing the public that. And And then the next highest up is an RFI process, which is a request for information, where they say, we want specific feedback on this topic. And very, very frequently, you can think of these two processes as being both pre and post the regular regulatory process. So in some cases, there will be notices and other documents that are published after the whole regulatory process is over, because the agency recognizes that there's some context that's missing, and that they're not getting enough information about the industry is not getting enough regulation about what they need. Excuse me, I'm going to get rid of that editing thing. Next is this, which is the same process, but what I've done is I've bumped up and noticed that this reg info, like those stages where it goes to OMB, the data on reg info is available at a different website for that process, right? So there's a linking back and forth between what's happening on regulations.gov and, at the same time, also the Federal Register website, going back and forth here. And this is the link to that infographic. So if you want to go back and get that. The other thing that I provided a link for here is the rules and how they do the cost benefit analysis that they do, which is called an RIA or RIA. Yeah. So if you want to read more, you can look at that link. And then the other thing is, here's a tutorial on the Federal Register, which I think is really excellent and talks even more about the fine-grained stages that they can talk about the differences between a rulemaking and a non-rulemaking process. And I am sure, as you read this, I am very sure that this is wrong. It's just too simple. And I have tried to kind of document the shifts that I understand, but I'm 100% confident that I am glossing over details that are vital, and I don't know what they are. So if you have feedback on how I should improve this talk, let me know, and I'll save these slides and I'll make them more complicated over time, and I'll redo this talk to understand how to work with regulatory data. All right, let's go to the next one. The next one is the structure of the docket data that comes out of the API of regulations.gov. And first, let me thank the Moravian team. They actually taught me how this works. I thought the way it works was dockets contain documents, and then documents kind of contained comments. And what they told me and showed me and demonstrated is that actually that is true most of the time, but there are some cases where you have this effect on the bottom here where a comment is actually associated with a docket and not the document, which creates for a very confusing conundrum of ideas. But I'd like to highlight data coming out of the API that I think is relevant for analysis. One is the docket type. The next is the rule stage, and I think I might have wanted to say major, rule stage on that should be one thing. And there's, whether or not energy is affected, whether or not small entities, and these are all of those things that are data about how they have to treat different regulations differently. Agencies, which can be plural at that stage. And from now on, right, frankly, it is possible to have a regulation that comes from multiple agencies. And then in the metadata in the JSON about a document, you have what document, the title of the document, whether or not comments are closed, ... But there's also data in the document itself, and that is not well represented in the JSON data that you have to kind of pull out. One is the action type. I don't see a clear indication of precisely what action type is inside the JSON data that comes down from the regulations.gov API. I could be totally wrong about this, but I don't see it there. And you also just have the summary. And the summary, in some cases, is the first place where you learn the reason, right? So you have these initiating processes, like why are they doing regulations at all, right? Well, that's included in the summary, is what is their justification for having this regulation at all. And then inside the comments, you have the document ID, the title, contact information, whether or not it was withdrawn. And of course, sometimes the comment is inside the JSON, and sometimes the comment is a file, which I probably should have in that diagram, the note that there are PDF files here. And at the document level, for the actual rules, there's usually a PDF version and there is an HTML version, with the HTML version being not a full HTML document, but a partial one, and it's still relatively well formed. So it's structured text, at least, if not a full HTML document. So, okay, so why does this matter? Now I'm going to escape out and kind of talk about the full context that you quite understand here. So the one of the key things here with this is that a full regulatory process does not include one single pass through this engine. And if we can go back to thinking about the use of electronic healthcare records inside the healthcare system, that has been a topic that has been regulated. I think probably HIPAA. I think the security and privacy rules of HIPAA probably serve as the first very large regulations of how electronic healthcare records should work. So that goes back to the Clinton administration. Probably before that, they were doing things that had to do with how bills would be communicated, but I don't necessarily think that's terribly interesting. But I think by the time you're talking about HIPAA, you are talking about features of how you would treat digital information that were specific to benefit patients. And that, I think that was probably one of the first big regulatory movements on how things had to be. But certainly, since meaningful use happened, which was in the 2000 Obama era regulations, this topic has been changing. And you think about clean water, you think about how we regulate plastics, how we there's been all this microplastics getting into our water supply stuff. All of these things are regulated over the arc of centuries, and so, but this going through this pipeline is kind of the pulse, right? It's like this happens pretty regularly, and every time they do it, they get more specific. And there is also, to be clear, one of the things that can go through here is a deregulatory process, right? So, they can get to the point where, hey, we've been doing something for 15 years and it's not working, so we're still going to stop doing it, right? And sometimes that's politically motivated, and sometimes that's practically motivated, but it's not correct to think of the regulations as a constantly growing thing. In reality, it's more like a bush that's being trimmed, right? It's growing in general, but it's also being trimmed constantly. So, so when I think about this regulatory process, there's two things that are confusing to me. One is I'm interested in the topic not at the individual regulatory level. What I want to understand is, for instance, the kinds of questions I want to ask are very big questions, like, is the way we use health technology in the United States working? And I might want to be more specific and say, is it working for patients specifically? Do they get to leverage their data? Do they get to maximize their data? Are they able to exercise their data? Or I might want to understand if clinical trials are effective. Because people think of clinical trials as that you wouldn't normally think of that as an EHR problem, but part of the first process for recruiting for a clinical trial is going through and figuring out who in a hospital system or a clinical data record qualifies for a particular clinical trial. So in some senses, who gets to be in clinical trials, who gets to benefit from ones who are successful, is directly related to how good the information systems are. So those are the kind of questions that I want to ask. And in many cases, it will be 6 or 7 different passes through this process that matter for understanding how a particular thing is being managed in the industry and whether or not regulations are effective. And what I want to know, for instance, when the American Medical Association, and I don't want to pick on them as a bad organization, there are problems with that organization, but I don't want to pick on them too much. But give an example, in general, the American Medical Association advocates on the interest of physicians. And so when a regulation gets to a place where um, uh, a particular thing is happening in the industry and a particular trend is going, let's call it, AI in healthcare or whatever, is that being regulated in a way that is responsive to the American Medical Association, or is it a different group of physicians, or is it a specific organization like Mayo Clinic, which has a lot of physicians who might be incentivized to have their perspective included, or whatever. What I want to understand is who is influencing the regulations over time, right? And so if there's 3 or 4 different topics that impact a topic that I care about, and let's say the American Medical Association has had a substantial influence on all of those, well, I want to know that, and I want to know what was changed and what the government is conceding to the American Medical Association, and ultimately, I'd like to figure out why. Right. But in order to do that, I have to be able to think in terms of the entity of the American Medical Association, figure out what they commented. And then I have to look at the delta between what questions were asked during the RFI, during the actual first version of the proposed rule, and then how they were responded to in the final rule. Right. So A, B, C are the kind of big steps for big regulations. They have an RFI, they have a notice of proposal rulemaking, and then I have a final rule. I want to see how the comments influenced what the regulators did, and I also want to know who's ignored. Like if there's an organization that is constantly, if they, again, to not pick on the American Medical Association, I think it would be just as big a problem to see that the American Medical Association was consistently ignored, because that means that we would be probably ignoring the interest of doctors, and it's not reasonable to totally ignore that stakeholder. But in order to think about that, I have to be able to connect the dots between this is a request for information, which has comments. This is a proposed rule, which has comments. This is a final rule. I believe the final rules themselves have comments too. So, and then this is the final regulation, and the final rule is unique because it also is the place where the agencies specifically respond to comments, and so that's the place where you're able to look back. So, I hope that I have provided a review of kind of why I care about regulations. One thing is that in general, I have to rely. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm still on Twitter, or I guess maybe I've decided whether we should be calling this X or not. I'm very conflicted about that. But the reason why I'm still on Twitter is because I still have people who will mention me and tell me, "Hey, Fred, have you seen this regulation, or what do you think about this regulation?" And that'll be the first time that I hear about a regulatory topic. In many cases, will be that there's an RFI or that there's an RFP. And so, and we do have some search terms set up to email us and all these kind of things, which regulations.gov will let you do. But in general, it is, I avoid searching on regulations.gov or federalregister.gov, because doing so in general does not allow me to get a picture of the regulatory process with enough granularity that I can see it as a continuous flow, and see topics changing and shifting over time. And so much less, and it is only with that context that I can then further understand who is influencing regulation. I don't think I have anything else to say, so I'm going to close this down, and thank you for watching all the way till this end. But I think this stuff is important, and so I really appreciate you watching. And please let me know in the comments if you feel like there's some aspect of the regulatory process I'm just totally ignoring here that is really important for my overarching goals of understanding who has influence, understanding whether or not things are working, and tracking what's happening with regulations. Um, because I would like to understand this better than I do. And I think I have a better than average understanding of the regulatory process for a layperson, probably even for someone who is a journalist, probably for someone who is even a healthcare wonk, for lack of a better word. But I certainly don't feel like I understand it um, at a roots level, and I would like to. So if you feel like there's things I should read or understand, please let me know. You can tweet at me. You can email me. My email is pretty obvious, and there's a dozen different ways to get a hold of me through the various platforms. Please feel free to do that. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.